The first thing I wanted to go over is last time, I know I said I wanted to do the other side of a nested form. And in talking to Chris about it, I realized, honestly, it's exactly the same. There are just a few minor differences. So the very first thing I wanted to cover before we actually dive into today's content is I added a form the other way. And I just wanted to show you what the code looks like and the pieces, and then give you guys a chance to ask any questions if you wanted to. So I had this opportunity to add a new category, and they could select shoes that already existed. You wouldn't have to include this part. I just felt like it for the sake of it. And then, or you could create a new shoe, and I give the option for 3 shoes. In adding that piece, there were a few things I had to do. One, I had to make a form for our category, and then my nested form was my shoes. And I will tell you that, to be honest, the way I made this was I copy and pasted my my other form, and I basically flip-flopped what was nested and what was unnested. So I took the category stuff and I made it with the F, and then I took all the shoe stuff, and instead of it being f.textfield brand, made it a nested form for shoes. The other big difference is when I fill in fields 4, it is always looking for an attribute of our model object. And so because a category has many shoes, not just one shoe, this one needed to be plural, whereas the other one was singular. So that's the only other real difference in the form itself. You'll also see that singular versus plural difference in our params. And I actually went out and wrote this one how we probably should have it. In that this one says shoes, plural attributes, and our other one says category, singular attributes. And it all is like Rails works so heavily to keep those relationships plural or singular based on if it should be plural or singular, if there are many, or if there are one. So that's kind of your good test or way to check that you're on the right page. And then the last piece is I added an accepts nested attributes. This one I just did with a reject proc. Most of the time, if you set up a nested form for has many, most of the time you're going to be creating new things, not finding or creating. So usually this is going to be your go-to for a has many. And then you can reject if they're blank. The final last piece is in the controller. Because I wanted this to show up 3 times, I said 3 times. This could have been, honestly, 10 times. And we could have had the opportunity to create 10 shoes here. If this refreshes. And we see a whole bunch of these. So this is just how we added the shoes. One other thing to note, and let me actually view this so we can see two screens. So I just want to show the one other difference is, notice here we did shoes.build, and in our other one we did build category. This can throw a few people off, and I just want to make sure it's pretty clear why they're different. And I'll even get rid of the 2 times just so it can even be more obvious. We want to compare line 9 and line 9. Does anyone know why we do these differently, those 2 build methods?
Because for at shoe, it belongs to one category, so that means you don't, so yeah, you're just building the one category that it belongs to, whereas for category, it has many shoes. So your first you're first invoking that array shoes of all the shoes that it has, and then you're building a new shoe within that array.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. The way I think of it or remember it, and I don't have my chat open, let's see what's in there. One builds a shoe, one builds a category. Yes, that is correct. But the way that I think about it too is, what is the return? Like, we couldn't write this as at shoe.category.build. And the reason why is, let's say the shoe is not yet associated to a category. The shoe is not yet associated to the category. The piece that I have highlighted right now would have a return value of nil, and we would be trying to do nil.build. And that's number one way to get one of those pesky no method error build for nil class. Over here, if we have no shoes, so if we have no shoes associated yet, this is not nil, it's an empty array. And really, when we dive down into it, it's actually like an active record associate. It's more than an array. It's, I'm blanking on the word. We're gonna even be dealing with them today. But it's an active record association. So it has, you can still add a method off of it. And so that's why when we do belongs to, we have to have this special method. And when we do a has many, we just can add the build to the end. So that's really the main difference, is how we call the build method. And this is also built into the documentation. If it's a has many, we add build to the end of the collection. If it's a belongs to, we have to do build underscore word. Ran through that pretty quickly. They are very similar, but I do want to give you guys the chance, if you do have any questions, a chance to ask them. So do you have any questions about how to do nested forms? One of these to go over here. There we go. Nested forms when we do the opposite way. No questions? Cool. So we're moving on. So Andrew or Brandon, I think it was Brandon who volunteered to do it. This
Yep.
might be, okay, cool. This
Got
might be a good point to say we will switch to talking about partials. And this is the perfect view to start talking about partials, because do you guys see any repetitive code here in what you see up? We have two different views. Do you see anything that's repetitive? And if so, what?
All right, in both, you're looking for errors. That's definitely for one. So that possibly could be a partial. You just probably have to change the what you're calling on, but that's basically it.
Yeah, you're right. You're right on the money. So there's a few partials that the labs really walk you through, and we will do one of those, which is having a form that gets shared between new and edit. But one of the things that I like to actually implement really early on in any project I do is to turn this into a partial, because we should have this message on every single form page that we do. And the only thing that will be different is this word category versus shoe. And so it's a really easy thing to turn into a partial and to dry up our code quite a bit. I will caution you, you don't want to make a partial if you're not going to use it more than once, because it actually can take a little bit longer for Rails to load partials. Like, so I've seen people where it's like every tiny little bit of a view is in a partial, and to load one view, they've loaded like 15 partials. That actually can really like slow down your program. But if you have big chunks that get reused, it's always the best idea to get rid of that repetitiveness and put it in a partial. So we will go ahead and we will refactor our code into a partial. And let me go ahead and share. I'm a big fan of relying on our documentation. So I'm going to share out what I like to use when I'm working through partials. And I want to point out there are a lot of different ways that we can render partials, and we'll see that when we do it with our form as well. We are going to need to do a partial with a local variable, and so we're going to have to go down to the other way. I don't know if you guys can hear my dog barking, but he's not happy on the porch. And so this one, we're going to turn it into an errors partial. And this one is a little bit out of convention because these errors are going to apply to everything. If I'm going to make a partial that applies to everything, which of these three folders do you think I should put it in?
Yeah. Layout.
Yeah. And when we name partials, one way we say that it's a partial and not a main view that gets loaded is we denote it with the underscore. So I will call this our errors partial. And then in our errors partial, just to kind of get this started, what we'll do is we'll drag and drop. I need to get rid of some of these files up here. We're going to just drag and drop the code that we already have. So this is the code that we want to have run. And really simply, if we were just using it for here, we could have a really easy time turning this into a partial, because in rendering partials, they still will have access to any instance variables you have available in here. So we could simply say render layout / errors in quotes. Let me check my syntax there. I might actually need to say partial. There's so many different ways to write it that I always, no, I think we could do it this way. So if we don't have to send in a local variable, we can keep it quite simple. Anyone know why I chose to include the folder that it is in? It's okay, we'll test it out. Was someone gonna say something? No, okay. So let's go ahead and test what this looks like. And why did I get rid of? My Zoom tools are in my way today. It will automatically look in the shoes folder. Thank you, Jesse. I'll show you guys that in a second. So in general, what partials do is they first will look in the folder that that file's in. And this is where it by default will look. If we want it to look somewhere else in a different folder, we would need to specify that with that folder name. So for example, we've only done this for the shoes. So let's go over to our new shoe model. And if we submit a blank shoe, we should get an error message. We got those. We didn't get an error message, which means I probably did something wrong. Render layout errors. Did it render my layout errors? Rendered shoes. Did not render my layout. Oh, you know, I didn't render my layout. I'm so silly. I forgot my equal sign. Whew. Close call there. Okay, we get it to still work. So it's working pretty nicely as is. And I did want to intentionally show you that it can read your instance variables. It is as if this code is dragged and dropped right where this line is. But the problem is we want to be able to use this in more than one place. So we will have to send in a local variable. Also, just to show you what it looks like if we had forgotten that this was in a different folder, I think seeing error messages is important. So you know how to identify them. It will tell you it can't find the partial. And it usually tells you where it was looking, although this one doesn't seem like it did. No, it just tells you that's a partial that it cannot find. And so that's should be like a key in your mind. If it can't find that partial, I need to specify what folder to look in. Because once it can't find it here, it's looking top level. And top level, it doesn't see anything named errors. So we'll put it back to how it should be. Layouts / errors. Now let's make this more flexible. So what I mean by that is I want to be able to use this same line of code for my categories. We want to be able to take that away and put this here, which means we're going to need to be able to be flexible about this instance variable. And this is where we will have a local. And so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to call this instance variable just object. And I tend to just you could do some interpolation here and you could figure out a way to say prohibited this object name. I'm a really big fan of just saying prohibited this from being saved because I don't think they need to see what object it is. And then we're going to need to give this object value. So if we go back, the screens are a little crazy right now. If we go back to how we need to send in locals, there are a few different ways to do it, as you'll see on here. We'll go ahead and we'll use what they've given us down here. There really are so many different ways of writing these. There's like super shorthand ways of writing them and really long written out ones. And I just like to make note of that. So if you see different documentation with the different examples, there are more than one ways to write it. in Rails in general, that is the case, is that there's like a long form way and then there's a shortcut way. So we're gonna write it out the long form way because I like to be explicit. So we're gonna make ours look like this. And we're gonna need to pass in our locals. So we will say that we are rendering a partial, layouts errors, and we are sending in some local variables. And the local variable that we wanna send in, the left-hand side, is what's gonna be defined in our partial. So we want the object to be given the value of our shoe. And I think that can be kind of the trickiest part, is just understanding that the left-hand side matches with what's in our partial, the right-hand side matches with what we have value to here. We can now put that exact same line of code in our categories, but instead of at shoe, it would be at category. So let's test it. See if that worked. Oh, didn't start to go. Perfect, we get all of our error messages still. And when I go to a new category and I click create category, we get an error message as well. So we're getting some really good error messages in here. And this is my favorite one to do first, because now every single form that you go and do, we can include the same code. So we could also go and add this to our shoes edit, because that one didn't have any errors in it. And now we automatically can see error messages for that as well. Any question as to what I have here so far?
One quick question. Is the partial part is declaring that the left-hand side of that statement is partial? Is that necessary?
You know, I don't think this is where it gets into the shorthand versus the longhand. There is another way to write this where we don't include that. But I want to know, I don't remember if with our locals, if it's going to make a difference. Let's just test. There's nothing wrong. Let's see what happens. Are they not going? Okay, so it didn't catch that this first part was our partial and the second part was our local. I think it's because we're now sending in 2 arguments. I wonder if I take away locals, if it will now be able to interpret those as our 2 arguments. Yeah, I think so. Okay, cool. So the idea is this is accepting basically 2 arguments, and we can either name what our arguments are, that this is the partial and these are the locals, or we can let it infer that. And so if we remove partial, we would also remove locals here.
All right, it's good to know.
Good question. And this is kind of what I mean by like the shorthand versus the longhand. Both ways work. The other one that we see that's really common and that your labs will have you do is you really don't need to repeat yourself when you make forms. So if we were to look at our new shoe form and our edit shoe form, do you see any difference between the 2? Besides that I added a class here, which we really don't need. I see no difference between the 2. And this will be true of almost all of your forms that you're new in your edit, unless you want to do something different between the 2 of them, and that your new and your edit will be essentially identical. And because form width is really flexible and can say, is the shoe a new instance? Is it an already existing instance? And change the post or the patch route. We can include the whole form in a partial because it will give us that flexibility. And same with our submit. You can also leave out part of it if you wanted to. Like if you really wanted to write a custom submit message that didn't say create shoe, but was like, add your creation to the world. And then over here was like, edit your creation. Or you wanted something super custom. We can do a partial that's just the middle chunk. It just is super important when we're dealing with partials that then we would send in F as a local variable because we would no longer know what F was. It's also one thing to keep in mind with partials is you would never want to send half of like your do and your end, or your if and your end blocks need to stay together. So either you would take an if and an end both to a partial, or you would leave your if and an end here and take the inside piece. You would never put like your if on, like, what I'm really trying to say is we would run into some major errors if we took all of that and left the header, because it still needs its matching end for that block of code, which I think is obvious, but just like to double check that we get that. And so for here, if we wanted to make a local for this, we would come over to our shoes, we would add a new file, we would follow that same convention of an underscore, which just denotes this isn't something that we're looking for in our controller. This is something that a view is going to render as a partial. And we'll go ahead and save it. It is nice that now we have it denoted in this folder, because if we render the form inside of the shoes, and then we also had a partial in categories, there'd be no conflict of interest, because it always first looks locally. And then again, we can just kind of copy and paste what we have here. And this one should be a little bit simpler because we can just render partial. Actually, we don't even need partial here. We can just say render form. And this alone should do it. So let's see if that works for both of these. Why not? And now we almost have the exact same page. It just is a little bit different at the top. Maybe it makes sense to actually render this inside of the form. That's kind of, if it's gonna be on all of them, then you might as well. If not, you might as well leave it like this. Let's make sure we didn't break any. That's gonna not break. So it looks like it still works. If we go to all shoes and we click edit, we now see it and it is all filled in. So it's pretty handy the way that it looks for it, and the way that it also has access to your instance variables. So I feel like partials are pretty straightforward, but that being said, this is a safe place. Anyone have a burning question about how to implement partials? Nope. Okay. I will say we could have done this just to be like, I don't know, kind of cool about the way we did it, is we could have actually done something like only taken this inside chunk. Let's actually only take this inside chunk. And the reason we might do this, I'll show you. And we would render our form, and then let's send it some locals, and we will send it what F is going to be over here. So in this case, F is just F, because that's what it represents. But the reason we might want to do something a little funky like this potentially is because basically I use this exact form in my new category. Like if I look over here, I use this exact form. Like I copy and pasted it. It was the same. Where did my form go? That, just to prove it. Oh, except for the category at the bottom. I probably should have left that part out. This category prompt, but the other pieces are the same. And so we could come in here and we can say render form. The difference is now we're going to look in shoes. So we would have to specify. And the other difference is now my F in my local is actually going to be shoe field. And let's get rid of this, because this is, that's not the part that's like local to all of them. I'm like losing track of where that even would go. Then too much editing inside of one thing. So basically this is going to render the form pieces of a shoe, and then the rest is dealing with a category. This is a weird way of doing it. I just want to show you that it's possible so you can see it in action. So let's go look at the edit, because I'm pretty sure I broke the new. So are we on an edit already? Yes. And that still looks the same. Let's just double check with a different shoe that it still works. Perfect. And then we also use this in the category, and we can see this now fills in the category. So I just kind of wanted to show you two different ways of doing it. I know this way is a little bit funky, but it would still work. So let's actually, just so all of our things work, we're gonna leave it like that. Cool. Okay. Last chance for questions before we move on.
So do we not need the partial symbol as we have it in the edit versus the new shoe?
So this is great question. So what I was trying to show is there are a lot of different ways to write the same thing when you're dealing with partials, because in general, in Rails, there is like a long way, and it's like the official way of writing it out. And then there are shortcuts where if you write it without the long way, it infers or like is kind of smart and can guess what you're trying to do. So if we basically, our render is going to look for two arguments, our partial and then locals. If we want to be more explicit about which argument is which, we can list it this way, or we can list it our short form way like we have on line 3. They are essentially doing the same thing. They'll be interpreted the same way. It's just two ways of writing identical code.
When you have the partial colon, that's just basically a keyword argument, right?
Yes, yeah. So now I'm giving these arguments that get passed in, they're just being passed in with the key and the value instead of being passed just as the value. So just being a little bit more explicit about what I'm trying to do, that's all. And it's flexible enough that it responds to you doing it either way. The big thing is, if you're going to be explicit about calling it a partial, you then have to be explicit about calling it locals. You have to, if you include any keys, you have to include all keys, or you can write it without the keys. Does that kind of clear things up?
Yeah, so it seems like render itself is just a method which accepts a hash, and we can either define the keys or just leave them out.
Yes, great way of putting it. And honestly, you can see that there's still some repetitiveness in here. I probably didn't do this the best way. I probably should have rendered a form, and then maybe my form had a like subcomponent that was just the shoe pieces so that my category could borrow it. But for the sake of moving on, I'm gonna leave it as this for now. I just wanted to show you, because I've run into a lot of people that want to partial out part of their form, and I just wanted to show that it's possible as long as you define what the F is. And you can define what the F is differently depending on where you are in a form, if you're in a nested form or not. Okay, so we're going to move on. And the next piece that I want to cover is, we've got so many cool things that I want to jump to. Which one's more important? Let's talk about scope methods. And so this is the very end of the curriculum this week. So there is a very solid chance that you guys have not gotten there yet. But the idea of we need to keep our code clean, that's kind of what this whole study group is about, by removing places that we repeat ourselves, but also we never should have like too much logic in our views. We really need ways to clean that up and to contain our logic in the controller. So we're going to revisit something that we did much earlier, and that is we made this great place that showed us the most expensive shoe. Let's see if it still works. No. Oh, shoot. So we must have something that doesn't have a price. That's okay, because we're going to adjust it so that this works even if something doesn't have a price. And so we're going to basically adjust this method today, because one of the things that you will see is that we want to be able to use what we learned in SQL, and it's been a bit, so you're going to have to refresh your mind. But using SQL is going to be our way to quickly query the database and to be able to display more interesting information in our views without having to do time-consuming Ruby code. And I call it time-consuming Ruby code because a sort by is a method that takes quite a bit of time to actually implement, or for it to run on the computer side relatively. And what it's also doing is it loads all pieces of information into the database, from the database into memory, sorts them, and then just returns one, which is in a way, a little bit of a waste. So we want to rewrite this using things that we have learned about queries and SQL statements. Does anyone have an idea of how we could rewrite this using SQL statements? So we have some handy, if you're like, I don't remember SQL at all, I'm gonna give you 2 good resources, sending them over in the chat right now. And we will take a close look at one of these. Where's my other one? Here we go. And these 2 things that I send to you are going to be really helpful when you get to a lesson called the Model Class Methods Lab, where it's going to have you join different associations together and find interesting info about each of them. And they're specifically going to be trying to get you to return like an active record association, not an array. And that might at the moment seem like a super minor difference, but an active record association, we have many more methods we can call on it, whereas an array, we're a little bit limited in what we can call. So we have some ideas. So let's try out some of these ideas. And I actually am a really big fan of trying them out in the console because I think it's a little bit easier to see what's happening. And I hopefully it gives you a way to try things out as you're working through your code. So we are going to select from shoes a shoe. And the nice part is this by default will send one back. But we've got a sort by price. So everything that we use is going to have to be some sort of active record query. So we've got some really, I love that we keep getting ideas in the chat. So I'm going to kind of show you what we can do with where. So where will return anything that matches a condition we give it. So if we happen to know what the highest price was, this would work out really well. Or even if we knew, if we just wanted any prices over 100, this would be a good statement to use as well. Which we only have one with a price over 100. And so right now it's going to be pretty obvious which one is our most expensive, but it is possible that we had more than one over 100. And just at the very first glance, I want you to take note of, because we used a query, that was the word I keep saying association. I wanted to say relation. We see that this returns an active record relation. The reason that's important is because any query words can be chained onto the end of an active record relation. So I can take this and I can use things like order, I can use things like limit. There are a lot of other ones that I'm like blanking on. But we can use any sort of query words on the end of this. We can't necessarily do that if it was an array. So I could have also done something like shoe.all.select, shoe.price is greater than 90. And we should get back the same items. Oh, but there's an undefined for nil class because I don't have, one of them I don't have a price. We'll add an if s.price. And we actually are going to get back the same info that we got back up here. But the difference is that down below, it's an array. And I do really want you to keep track of that as you're working. In the later labs, the Model Class Methods labs, because it is a big difference in what you're doing. One command that only works on active record relations is the .pluck command. And I bring this up only because I know that you're going to have an error message that says something about no method error for .pluck on array. And it's because you might have done a really great line of Ruby code to return what they were looking for. But because it was Ruby code, it returned a plain array. And we can't actually use pluck on an array. So here, I'll show you what I mean by that. So an array, if we tried to use pluck, and pluck is just something that grabs the info about that you tell it to pluck. So like, let's say we wanted to grab all of the colors. I don't know. Why not? Oh, it did work. Huh. I didn't think that was going to work. Well, just surprised myself. And then we'll do it on here. Well, this is not even proving the point that I was trying to prove, because it worked for both. Well, you couldn't do other things on the array, like you couldn't, we couldn't add a where clause to the array. So we couldn't say just like where, watch this one like work too. It's not gonna work. But we couldn't say like where color is black, because we have an undefined method where for an array. But if we were to do this same code on the end of this other where, why did I forget the dot? It will work. So it's kind of this idea of when we have this return value that says active record relation, it's much more flexible and can take multiple query statements chained to it. So let's go back to our kind of original challenge. We've got some other ideas in here from Lucy. And you are right, sort by is the Ruby word, but for any command you have in Ruby that's going to help you with it, usually there's a similar command in our like query or active record queries. And so we can use something like order by. So let's go ahead and we will do shoe.order by. I think it's actually just order. I think it is order. We'll see. We can, errors are free is what I always like to say. Does this look like it got ordered by price? I believe it did. And the nice part is this one didn't break when we had something that was nil. It just put the thing that was nil at the bottom. Whereas our Ruby code did break when it tried to compare nil. And then this ordered correctly, and if we just want one, we could add a limit 1. And this is going to give us still an active record relation, which is kind of nice because it means we could call other things out of it. But it also looks a little bit more like an array, because in general, limit is set up to, you know, give you multiple things back. And so we could also use something like, if we just wanted one and we knew we just wanted one, we could do something like last instead, because both of those will work. But now we've made it no longer an active record relation. And so we can come over here and let's replace this code. Yeah, there is actually a max. Let's try that, because that I don't use max a lot, but there is a max. So let's see if that works. I like the idea. Max. This is the thing I'm not sure though, is what does this look like in the inside there? Misuse of aggregate function. I'll follow your syntax, but I don't think in an SQL statement, we don't usually do queries like that. Yeah, I didn't think so.
You could potentially do a subquery with max. I forget exactly how it works, but I remember that in this case, when you're getting the max of something, you sometimes have to use like a subquery.
Yeah, what do I need to pass in instead of price then? That's the question. Maybe I just need
I think
to
it's
string.
like, I don't know, I remember it being like max where max equals or something. I don't really remember. I remember.
Try the full word maximum.
Oh, okay. Why not? There we go. Coming in with saving us. Oh, I did have one that was 700. I was like, that doesn't look right. Yes, I did have one that was 700. And so we could, let's try this with the where. I don't know if it will work like this. Where price is our max. This is where I think we would have to make it more of a subquery, because I think, yeah, where. I don't think we can do this query. Oh, that gave us the right one. Cool. So we have 2 ways of writing it. I love having more than one way of writing it. And just to comment on both of these, what word could I use here instead of shoe?
self.
And technically when you use self, you actually, in here, it implies if you don't include self, it's going to by default call this method on self. So technically our method can look as simple as that. And this is what we call, and I'm going to clean this up after our study group because I want to make it easier for you to read through all of this with our comments and different pieces. But this would be considered a scope method. It's written as a regular class method, but it is something where we are scoping in and using our queries to find a smaller group. The only thing that I probably would be better if let's write actually 2 scope methods, because I really like the idea of them returning active record relations, and this other one's going to just return one thing. So we're going to just call it order by price, and we're going to include this, and that way this is going to be a little bit nicer. We'll leave that code there. Because in truly calling it a scope method, this will order it by price, and we can use this in more than one place. And what I mean by that is we can come over here and, where's our code? If we go back to just the, well, let's see if this works first of all. Rand and color for active record relation. Oh, so this still returned an active record relation. So we probably need to turn it into one thing. Perfect, so now that's back working. But the other thing I want to show you is all of these shoes are in a random order. If we wanted them to be ordered by price, we can now take this order by price method. And I want you guys to kind of guess, do you think it would be better to call this method in the view or in the controller?
In the controller.
Good call. So we'll hop over to the shoes controller. Basically, at almost all times it'll be in the controller. And instead of doing something like shoe.all, we can actually do shoe.order by price. And now watch this and the order should change. And hopefully these are our ones without a price. Nice. And if we edit this price and we make this, let's make these more expensive than our other ones. Black, gray. I think it's gonna only let us do it if we put things for all of these. And now let's go back to all shoes. And that got moved to the top because that is now our most expensive one. And so this is where scope methods come into play. They allow you to give a lot of flexibility to your application, and they're gonna allow us to chain them. And so this one is gonna order, maybe we only want shoes with the condition of new. So we could say self.new shoes. Why not? And we can do a simple where condition is new. One thing to note too, this is going to be another place where you see multiple ways of writing the same thing. And it has to do with, are you writing pure SQL or are you writing more of an active record relation query that will then be transformed into SQL? So if I wanted this to look a little bit more like pure SQL, it would look like maybe something a little bit more like this. And those should give you the same thing back, as long as I didn't mess up. And then we can say order by price. You know what, I only care, this is a long list, I only care about seeing the new shoes. So even after they've ordered by price, let's change them to just the new shoes. And I probably should do that in the opposite way. Oh man, we only have 2 new shoes. Need self or shoe before the new shoe statement. So here actually is, this is the really cool part, is if you don't include self, it infers self. So I could also write it like that and it's gonna be the same thing because it always infers that this is gonna be called on self. But good point. And then we actually might want to do it the opposite way because it's probably better to limit and then order instead of ordering everything and then limiting it just down to 2. And let's add one more. I want another shoe to be a condition of new, just to make sure we can see that this worked. Oh, that was my, that one that I just edit is my only one with a condition of new, bright orange. And let's look at all shoes. Now we have 3 shoes that are new and in order of price. And so I just wanted to show you that that's how you can use these, and they can be chained. Notice we didn't have to do .all because these are by default already looking at the database and returning like the select all feature. These are also really nice because we can use them in, we can use them with our relationships. So I do have a place where I have all categories, and for each category, it lists its shoes. If we go over to that view, and actually, this is a weird spot where I'm gonna use it in the view, but I'm listing their shoes. You wouldn't really wanna do this, but just, there are better ways of doing it that we can go over later. But if I was really desperate and I wanted to show these by price, I can add on to here order by price. Honestly, probably I'd want to do that on like a category show page, not an index page, so I could do it in the controller. But I wanted to show you that these can be chained onto collections as well. So we've gotten our collection of shoes. This just is a shoe class method, so it can be used on any collection of shoes, even if it's a category shoes. It doesn't have to be the full thing. And then we should see these things switch around a little bit. Or we could do just new shoes here, or we could do both of the commands, and this list will get a lot smaller. So just a cool way of changing up what you display to the user and organizing your data, and always should be done in the model. One last comment on this, and then we'll touch on something else. One of those documents that I sent you, where is it? Is over here. This one is my favorite one about scope methods. Because they show you more than one way of doing it. They show it writing it as a class method, and then they also show it as writing it as a scope method, which this tends to be the syntax that we use. It is doing the exact same thing, but just so that, one, it's a little bit cleaner. This took 1 line, this took 3 lines. And so it's a shortcut because we know we might have a lot of these in our code and they'll take up a lot of space. And so instead of having all of these scope methods, we would write scope order by price. And I always have to make sure I get my syntax right because I usually forget this comma. And then we would stick this in here. Should leave that here for now. So those 2 things would do the exact same thing. Do I have that looking right? I think so. Let's go test it. So all shoes should still be ordered by price. And it looks like they are still ordered by price. We didn't have anything break. And you can see how in general, this is just a lot cleaner if all of ours are written this way. We do new shoes. And then we take this and we put it in here. It just is a little bit cleaner to actually write it like that because we're taking up a lot less lines of code at the end of the day. Questions that you guys might have about these kind of scope statements?
Question. So when we have it, as you just wrote it there, right? You said scope, and then you followed by new shoes, followed by proc, and then where, and everything like that. So when you do that way, when you're calling it, is always going to be called on a class, not necessarily the instance of the shoe. Is that right?
Always will be called on a class or a collection of shoes.
Or a collection of shoes. Okay. Okay.
And specifically, like that collection needs to be an active record relation, not a not an array. Yes.
Okay.
Which is why we want these to return active record relations, because these can be chained onto each other, but like they couldn't be chained onto something that returned just a blank array. And so you limit yourself if you start using Ruby and you return arrays, because now you're at the end of the road, you can't add anything to it.
So you could chain it, like you can start using these, right? The scopes, and then from there start going into your normal Ruby, but just know that you can't go back into using these again. Like if you were chaining, like multiple chaining for some strange, obscure reason, you know, you can't ever really jump back to this kind of scope.
Yes, and I would also challenge you to say, if there's a way you can do it in Ruby, there is probably a way you can do it with SQL. It can be difficult, but it can be done. The one, there's like so many things I wanted to cover today. This happens every single time. The other thing that I'm going to cover, I think I'm going to save it because it works so much better with if logged in and not logged in. And I'll just go ahead and tell you what it was going to be. Is we were going to talk about the helpers, this helpers folder. And when you put things in this helpers folder, I just think that we don't have any examples right now in this project of things I would move to the helper. We will once we've done authentication stuff and nested routes. And so I'm going to say, and it's a pretty quick lesson of when to put things in here. Essentially, stuff in here is going to be only helpers that get displayed to your view. And so we'll kind of circle back to some of those helpers. The last scope method I want to do before we're out of here is one that's a little bit more challenging, because these are easy examples and you guys are probably gonna have more questions about challenging ones. And that is, I want us to do a scope method where we are going to order our categories by number of shoes. So when we display our categories, and they might already be in order of number of shoes, I think they are, shoot. So we're gonna order them by reverse number just so we can change it up. But basically I want to see pumps first, then sand. We want the ones that have less first, because we're gonna reverse the order. This is just lucky that they're in that order. And so we wanna know which category basically has the most number of shoes and have them ordered that way. Could we put something in here to order? Oh, we've already got some good stuff coming in. We will have to use a group by. So that's a solid note, Lucy. Let's remember we need to use a group by. We will need to use an order, because in what we're trying to do, we've said that in the name of it. We will need to do something where we're thinking about both our category and our shoe. Because remember, a category has many shoes. On the category table, is there any information about shoes? Like if I was to look in the schema on my category table, do I have any info about shoes? No, our shoes have info about our category, but our category doesn't have info about our shoes. And because of this, if I want to kind of do this like cross model scope method where I say, what's my category with the most shoes? I'm going to have to join these two tables, because I'm going to want info from both tables, because I need to know these category IDs in order to count up how many shoes I have. And so that's kind of a hint. If you want to do something where you don't actually have the data on that table, you're going to have to do a join. And so the way we'll start this is we'll actually start by thinking that we want to join. I honestly can't remember if I put an S with that or not. I don't think I do. With shoes. Is my console still open? Perfect. So let's just try this here. I know it's at the bottom. I don't think I can clear it from here. So we'll go join shoes. Oh, it is joins. That's why we wanted to test it out. As we're going, what that is going to do, and let me just pretty print it, is we now are going to have all of our categories listed out. Take a close look. I really want you to notice what we're seeing when we join these. What is true about this data that we see output when we join those?
I think it's repeated because we didn't join them on anything.
Ah, it is repeated, but are they all repeated or are only certain ones repeated?
Only certain ones.
And if we compare, so this actually works out really well. If we compare which ones are repeated to what we've got listed over here on the right, pumps only has one shoe. Do we see pumps repeated more than once? Sandals only has one shoe. It only appears one time. High heels have 3 shoes, and they appear 1, 2, 3 times. And sneakers have 6 shoes, and sneakers appear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So this join is kind of helpful, and I just really like to emphasize this, is that when it joins them, what's going to happen is every time there is a shoe with the category ID, that category will appear. So this is basically going to give us some hint as to how we are going to be able to count them, because if we grouped all of these guys together, we could, or all of the sneaker guys, I wasn't trying to highlight the high heels, we can count how many times the sneakers appeared. And if the sneakers category appeared 6 times and the high heels appeared 3 times, well, the sneakers appeared by far more than the high heels appeared. Does that kind of make sense? This is a hard concept, so I just really like to emphasize that visually of when we join them, the ones that happen more then are going to appear more.
I guess I still don't really understand how it did this, because don't you normally in SQL have to say like join on choose, you know, category ID equals ID from the category table? Is that just Active Record automatically doing that, or like?
So part of it is Active Record gives you a little bit of more powerful like queries. I think I sent them out in one of the Odin project documentation that I sent out is really useful on Active Record queries. And essentially there are different, like it's using SQL, but there's a little bit of like shortcuts built in because we're using this with Active Record. So we don't have to say what we're joining it on.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
Yeah. But so after we join them, we'll now have more, the categories will show up more. Oh my gosh, I'm taking too long on here, sorry. And then what we'll want to do is we'll actually want to group them by the thing that is the same for each of these. So really by the categories ID. And because we've now joined 2 tables, category has an ID and shoe has an ID. So we need to be a little bit more specific on what we're joining them on. We could join them on category ID because that's an attribute from the other table, or we could group them on categories.id, which would be a way of saying, look at the categories table and group them by the IDs that we have here. And then what we will want to do is we'll want to order them by the count, and I usually get this syntax off, so if this doesn't work, I apologize. We're going to order them by the count of how many times we saw that ID appear. So we're essentially going to order them by the count of our category ID. And I did miss something here. This needs to be in straight SQL, so I might need to write it like that instead as a string. Count our category ID, and then we can say descending or ascending. Okay, we'll close that, and let's see what it gave us. The wrong number of arguments. Group by, gave 1, expected 0. Group. Oh, I think we just need group here. There we go. And now they're in order, the opposite order that we want, but if we put them in ascending, we now get them from lowest to highest number. So that I did jump through that really quickly, but I just kind of wanted to even put this out here so you can have it saved as something to go back and look at, because I think this is a really hard one to write on your own. And so I just like to show an example of how we would do that and to help you at least start to see the visualization of how that happens. Now I know it is time to leave, so if any of you guys have to jump off, no problem. Any last questions before I go? Because I raced through that a little bit at the end.
I'm a little confused about why did you have to join? Why could you make, oh, is this because you're in the categories table?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, I see, I understand now. I thought you were doing this in the shoes table. And I was like, why did they have to join the, yeah, okay, makes sense.
Yes. And then we used category ID just because it was something that is a unique attribute, whereas like just ID is ID for category and ID for shoe. And so it would get confusing and not know which table you're talking about. But that's the thing that happens more than once. Cool. We covered a lot. If you have any questions that are follow-up questions, feel free to pass them my way. Other than that, I will let you guys go. Thanks for being here, and sorry we jumped around a lot. So, bye guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.